Okay, I'm going to go through a few things about validity and assessment from Chapter 7 and why our measures may or may not be useful that we are using in education. So first of all, the two overarching concepts that are most important from this are validity and reliability. And validity, in the simplest terms, is the extent to which an assessment measures what it's supposed to do. And when we say assessment from here on out, I don't want you to think about a test only because there's lots of different kinds of assessments. We can assess ourselves, we can assess learning styles, we can assess our perceptions of job involvement. Those are all assessments. A test is something specific to a content exam. Reliability, on the other hand, determines the extent to which the assessment gives the same answer every single time. And no matter how good a test is, if it doesn't give us a similar answer, assuming nothing else changes, it really doesn't have any value to us. For example, if you had a bathroom scale and you stepped on that bathroom scale one morning and it told you weigh 120 pounds, and you came back the next day and it said you weighed 150 pounds, and the day after that it said you weighed 105 pounds, that bathroom scale, although it has the ability to weigh, it has no reliability because it can't give you the same answer every time, assuming your weight's not fluctuating by 30 pounds every day. So a couple of issues here is one is a test can be reliable but not valid. You can get the same wrong answer and it'll do it every single time. So for example, if a scale is not calibrated correctly, it can give you the same weight every single time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is an accurate assessment. On the other hand, if the test is valid, it is reliable. If the test measures what it's supposed to, then it has to do it every time. Otherwise, it's not valid, because if the definition of validity is it does what it's supposed to do, then it's got to be able to do it all the time. So we can have this idea, we can have a reliable test that's not valid, but if you have a test that is valid, it is inherently reliable. So validity, how's that established? Well, for the most part, I'm going to use some examples from public schools. Content validity is established by content experts. And really what they end up doing is they spend a lot of time, and some of you may have worked on STAR tests, using content experts to design questions. The tests that come with textbooks, in theory, are developed by the people who wrote the textbooks. And in theory, those people are considered content experts. The quality by which that they develop validity measures, I think, is sometimes a little bit suspect. And the textbook gave an example of a situation where they ran into the issue with content validity. There wasn't much agreement between the tests in the back of the book and what was actually in the chapter. So this creates a problem for schools because the content of the courses is coming from the teachers. And I still think that by and large, those teachers really depend upon a textbook as their curriculum. And I will be first to admit it's been many years since I've taught public school biology or chemistry. But I still think that there is a high reliability on, and I'm using that in terms of dependency, a high dependency is a better word for that, on those textbooks. The assessment of that content, really the overarching assessment of content, comes from the state. So you are potentially running into a disconnect between a textbook company developing a book that a teacher uses as curriculum. If the teacher then uses the tests from the book, there's a chance, a pretty high chance, that it's not going to connect well to the assessment of that content, which is the STAR test. That's a problem, and I think that there's a reasonable chance that that's creating some of the problems that we have with the STAR exam, is a lack of validity, content validity, from the exam back to the content being taught. And the desire to have some sort of measure for students, that being the STAR test, is so high that people are not willing to take the time to really look at the possibility that something may not be correct. So how is validity established with other measures? For example, the t-test. That is supposed to be a valid measure of a teacher's ability to teach. Again, this was theoretically developed by content experts, and it took them they identified what they considered valuable teaching behaviors, and they developed a rubric that goes with that to identify the behaviors that a person sees. Now, whether or not a person who scores highly on that, is considered an expert teacher, I've not seen the evidence of that. So I don't think that the state, and I may be wrong, has closed the loop on, we have established this measure of validity for teaching, quality teaching, but how else might we have established concurrent validity to say, well we're using this assessment for an expert teacher, but is that person really an expert teacher by other measures? I think there's an opportunity to see if that is true as some of the changes with House Bill 3 come through in terms of finding people who are master teachers and connecting that back to the t-test. But that still is a struggle to determine whether or not that is a valid measure of quality teaching. And the question I think that you need to ask yourself when working with your teachers is, how do teachers establish validity response processes and internal structure within their own assessments? That is a difficult and time-consuming process. I think that that's something that we need to have a further discussion on, about, especially in relation to your projects. If you're doing things related to assessment, is how are those processes established by a classroom teacher themselves, or are they just simply using the test at the back of the book and hoping that, or that test bank, and hoping that works? Very briefly, I'll give an example of an issue that I was made aware of when I was a principal. This is at I guess it's the largest school district in Texas, down by Houston. And they had made a decision within their high school math department that each of the math teachers would make a test so that nobody had to write a single test. And they would share those tests. So I might write the test for the first unit. Somebody else would write the test for the second unit, but I would have to use that person's test. And they ran into problems with the validity of that, because even though somebody else is writing the test, I'm still teaching it the way, in my mind, works for me and the students I have, and not designing an assessment by myself to match up with what I wanted my students to be able to do and the way that I was providing instruction. And it created a number of problems with students not doing well, because they had no validity in the way that those assessments worked. So what do these mean for you? Is it possible you'll be using some type of assessment? Remember, that's not the same as the test. You're going to need to consider the issues of validity, especially if you're going to use or going to create or use some non-normal assessment. And what I mean by that is, if you want to be able to measure behavior, you'll need a valid assessment that has constructive validity and doesn't have consequential validity. When we had our discussion the other day in class here on campus, there was a wide range of things that people were talking about assessing. If you're using something that's established like a STAR test or an end of course test, even though we know it probably has its issues, it's something that's pretty safe. If you're going to go out and find something else about measuring some teacher perceptions or principal behaviors, student behaviors that are self-reported, student behaviors that are reported by a teacher, there are some things that you're going to have to take in consideration about the construct validity. Does a score on that really accurately measure what it is that you're wanting to gather data on? And that's a really difficult thing to do. So reliability. The basis of reliability is that something works the same way all the time, that it doesn't vary assuming nothing else varies. So there's four major types that you need to consider. There's alternate form, which means an example of that would be when you took the GRE test. You didn't all take the same GRE test. You took alternate forms of that, and the goal is for the company that developed that is to have a similar score no matter which form of the test that you took. There is a test-retest reliability, meaning that you give a test one time, you wait a period of time, it's usually about 4 to 6 weeks, and give the same test again. That time period, if it's too short, the students will remember what they put before, whether it's right or wrong, they'll put the same thing again. And if you wait too long, they'll actually will learn something and know that test is no longer a valid assessment of what it is that you're trying to measure. So it's generally considered that it's about 4 to 6 weeks is enough time that they have forgotten what they wrote before, but they haven't changed further. Internal consistency has to do with how questions load together into a survey, for example. And if you remember the job involvement survey that we used in our exercise, that had multiple questions to measure the construct of job involvement. And when that was developed, there may have been questions that didn't load well into that. And there's a measure for that called Cronbach's alpha that will determine if certain questions don't load well. An easy way for you as an educator to look at this is if you give a test and everybody misses the same question, everybody misses question number 4, then the odds are that question does not load well into and would interfere with the internal consistency of the measure that you're trying to establish. The last one is Integrator Reliability. This is where you have some level of assurance that two people are scoring something the same way. The state tries to establish Integrator Reliability with T-test training. So when they have principals or other administrators come in to evaluate teachers, they are trying to establish Integrator Reliability. So in theory, it shouldn't matter who comes to your room and watches you. If you're a good teacher, everybody should be able to say that you're a good teacher. And if you're a bad teacher, everybody should say that you're a bad teacher. Challenge with that is the Integrator Reliability, I think, probably is a little bit suspect. That it really depends upon what's going on in the building at any one time in terms of an administrator being able to really pay attention to that. If things are slower, you may take more time and be more critical. If things are more busy and you've got to get it done and you run out of time, you may be a little bit more flexible about it, or vice versa. Another example of Integrator Reliability that we're going through right now in the College of Ed is we have introduced a new writing assessment for entrance into the graduate programs. And our faculty are reading those right now. And we have another faculty member who's working on the Integrator Reliability because we would like to know that if somebody is a good writer, which is the purpose of that assessment, that we would all know what good writing is. And if somebody's a bad writer, that we would all agree that this is an example of bad writing within a measure of reasonable consistency. The university is also looking at the writing proficiency exam and moving that into writing intensive classes. And I asked the question the other day about, well, how are we going to establish the Integrator Reliability so that if we say this is good writing and that writing's occurring in multiple classes, it shouldn't matter where the class is. We have to have enough reliability between the people assessing that writing to ensure that it is truly good writing.